October 21st, 1995. On a tour bus parked outside a venue in New Orleans, Shannon Hoon, the golden voice who had sung "No Rain" to chase away the world's storms, lay motionless in his bunk, finally silenced by the very rain that had never stopped falling inside his head. At 28, the man whose music had brought sunshine to millions through radio waves and MTV screens had succumbed to the darkness he had spent his entire career trying to sing away. The small pile of white powder on his nightstand told the final chapter of a story he had been filming himself for years, each frame a confession to demons only he could hear. His video camera sat silent on the table across from his bunk, its red recording light extinguished after capturing over 200 hours of Shannon's most intimate moments. His struggles with addiction, his fears about fame, his desperate attempts to make sense of a world that had elevated him to stardom while he felt like he was drowning in plain sight. What should have been the documentation of a rising star's journey had instead become a heartbreaking record of a gentle soul's descent into darkness, a visual diary of how talent and torment could coexist in the same fragile vessel. The official cause of death would be listed as acute cocaine intoxication. Clean, medical, final. But those who knew Shannon understood that his death was the culmination of a much longer struggle, the battle between the joyful voice that had given hope to countless fans and the broken heart that could never quite believe it deserved to be loved. The irony was devastating. The man who had sung "No Rain" to chase away the clouds had been living under his own personal storm for years. The news of his passing sent shockwaves through the alternative rock world and beyond. Here was the voice that had defined the optimistic side of Generation X. The artist who had made millions of people feel less alone with a simple song about wanting the sun to shine. Yet he had died alone on a tour bus, surrounded by the trappings of success but isolated from the human connection he had spent his entire life seeking. What if the real tragedy wasn't just his death, but the fact that someone whose music brought so much joy to the world couldn't find a way to save himself? What if the cameras that captured his every moment had been witnesses to a preventable destruction? What if the voice that sang about rain was really crying out for help in the only language he knew? But to understand how Shannon Hoon's story ended in that lonely tour bus, we must first understand how it began. In a small Indiana town where a sensitive boy learned to use music as both medicine and poison, where dreams of escaping the ordinary led him straight into the heart of his own destruction. The year was 1967, and in Lafayette, Indiana, a baby boy took his first breath in a working-class family that had no idea they were raising someone destined to become the voice of a generation. Richard Shannon Hoon entered the world during the summer of love, but his childhood would be marked more by struggle than by peace and music. His father left when Shannon was young, leaving his mother Nell to raise him and his sister Anna mostly on her own, a situation that would plant early seeds of abandonment and insecurity that would follow him throughout his life. From the very beginning, there was something different about Shannon that set him apart from other children in their blue-collar neighborhood. He was intensely sensitive, almost otherworldly in his awareness of emotions and atmospheres that others seemed to miss entirely. While other boys his age were playing sports or getting into typical childhood mischief, Shannon was drawn to quieter pursuits, writing poetry, listening to music for hours on end, and creating elaborate fantasy worlds that seemed more real to him than the sometimes harsh realities of his daily life. The Hoon household was one where music served as both escape and expression. Nell encouraged her son's artistic inclinations, recognizing that he had a gift that needed nurturing even if she couldn't always understand where it might lead. Shannon's voice, even as a child, had an unusual quality, a trembling vulnerability that could convey more emotion in a single note than most people could express in entire conversations. But there were also early signs of the fragility that would later prove so devastating. Shannon was prone to intense mood swings, periods of deep melancholy that seemed far too profound for someone so young. He would sometimes disappear for hours, walking alone through the fields and forests around Lafayette, returning with stories about conversations he'd had with trees and animals that his family chose to see as imaginative rather than concerning. Could these early experiences of feeling different, of being more sensitive to the world's pain than seemed normal, have planted the seeds for both his later artistic genius and his ultimate destruction? Even as a child, Shannon seemed to understand that he experienced life more intensely than others. And while this would later become the source of his musical power, it also made him vulnerable to forms of suffering that most people could barely imagine. The escape route that would eventually lead Shannon to both stardom and tragedy began to form during his teenage years when he discovered that music could serve as a kind of medicine for the pain he carried inside. He taught himself to play guitar and began writing songs that captured the complex emotions he struggled to express in everyday conversation. His lyrics even then revealed an unusual depth of insight into human nature, and a precocious understanding of how beauty and sadness could coexist in the same moment. But it was his voice that truly set him apart. Shannon possessed a singing style that seemed to come from some deep, wounded place within him, a trembling, almost fragile quality that could break your heart with its vulnerability, while simultaneously lifting you up with its strange, otherworldly beauty. When he sang, it was as if he were channeling something larger than himself, giving voice to all the lost and lonely souls who had ever felt like outsiders in their own lives. The connection between Shannon and his childhood friend William Bailey, who would later become Axl Rose of Guns N' Roses, was particularly significant during this formative period. Both boys were outsiders. Both were drawn to music as a way of making sense of their complicated lives, and both would eventually find their way to Los Angeles in search of something that Lafayette, Indiana, could never provide. But where Axl would eventually channel his anger and frustration into aggressive rock anthems, Shannon's approach to music was more introspective, more concerned with healing than with destruction. As Shannon moved through his late teens, it became increasingly clear that his destiny lay somewhere beyond the borders of his small hometown. He began talking about California, about Los Angeles, about the music scene that was supposedly flourishing on the West Coast. To his family and friends, these dreams seemed impossibly ambitious for a boy from Indiana who had never traveled more than a few hundred miles from home. But Shannon had an unshakable conviction that music was his calling, that he had something important to say that the world needed to hear. The decision to leave everything behind and head west was both inevitable and terrifying. Shannon had no connections in the music industry, no real plan beyond a vague belief that he would somehow find his way to the people who would understand his vision. All he had was a backpack, a guitar, a few half-finished songs, and a voice that could make angels weep. It was enough to get him started, but it would never be enough to save him from himself. The journey from Lafayette, Indiana to Los Angeles was more than just a geographical relocation. It was a transformation that would turn Shannon Hoon from a sensitive, small-town dreamer into the voice of a generation, and ultimately into a cautionary tale about the price of artistic sensitivity in a world that often mistakes vulnerability for weakness. The late 1980s arrived in Los Angeles like a fever dream of neon lights and impossible promises, a city where every street corner seemed to hold the potential for either stardom or destruction, often both at the same time. Shannon Hoon stepped off the Greyhound bus at the downtown terminal with everything he owned crammed into a single backpack, his guitar case clutched in one hand, and a heart full of songs that no one had ever heard. At 21, he was just another hopeful musician in a city that chewed up dreamers and spit out cautionary tales. But he carried with him something that couldn't be taught or manufactured, a voice that seemed to channel pure emotion. The early months in Los Angeles were a harsh education in the realities of chasing dreams without a safety net. Shannon slept on couches, in cars, sometimes in the parks when all other options were exhausted. He survived on convenience store food and the occasional kindness of strangers, but he never once considered going back to Indiana. The music scene that had drawn him west was everything he had hoped it would be. Creative, diverse, alive with possibility. But it was also more competitive and unforgiving than anything he had experienced in his sheltered Midwestern upbringing. It was during this period of struggle and uncertainty that Shannon met the musicians who would eventually become his bandmates in Blind Melon. Roger Stevens, Brad Smith, Glenn Graham, and Christopher Thorne were all talented players looking for something that the LA scene wasn't providing. A sound that was more organic, more emotionally honest than the hair metal and punk that dominated the clubs. When they heard Shannon sing for the first time, in a cramped rehearsal studio in North Hollywood, something clicked that none of them had experienced before. Shannon's voice was unlike anything in the alternative rock landscape that was beginning to emerge. Where other singers relied on volume or aggression to convey emotion, Shannon's power came from vulnerability. He could make a whisper sound like a scream and turn a scream into something that felt like a prayer. His lyrics were poetry wrapped in melody, dealing with themes of alienation, longing, and the search for authentic connection in an increasingly artificial world. The band's name, Blind Melon, came from a phrase Shannon had heard his grandfather use to describe someone who was oblivious to their surroundings, and it seemed to perfectly capture the feeling of being lost in plain sight that characterized much of Shannon's experience. They weren't trying to be the loudest or the most shocking band in town. They wanted to be the most honest, to create music that could serve as a soundtrack for the inner lives of people who felt like they didn't quite fit in anywhere. The breakthrough moment came when Shannon's old friend Axl Rose invited him to contribute backing vocals to Guns N' Roses' Don't Cry. The collaboration not only provided Shannon with some much-needed income, but also gave him his first taste of what it felt like to be part of something bigger than himself. Standing in the studio, hearing his voice blend with one of rock's most recognizable sounds, Shannon experienced a kind of validation that he had been seeking his entire life. But success, even in small doses, came with complications that Shannon wasn't prepared to handle. The attention from the Don't Cry collaboration led to increased interest in Blind Melon, which led to showcase gigs, which led to record label interest, which led to the kind of pressure and scrutiny that Shannon had never experienced before. For someone who had always used music as a private form of therapy, the prospect of sharing his most intimate thoughts with the world was both thrilling and terrifying. The recording of Blind Melon's first album became a study in creative tension and personal struggle. Shannon poured his heart into every song, crafting lyrics that revealed more about his inner life than he had ever shared with another human being. No Rain, the song that would eventually make him famous, was written during a particularly dark period when Shannon was struggling with depression and feelings of isolation. The lyrics, about wanting to escape from sadness and find a place where the sun always shines, were painfully autobiographical. Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? For Shannon, the question was becoming increasingly relevant as Blind Melon's profile grew and the music industry began to take notice of their unique sound. He had achieved everything he had dreamed of since leaving Indiana. A record deal, a platform for his music, the respect of his peers. But the cost was becoming apparent in his increasing anxiety, his growing dependence on substances to cope with pressure, and his sense that success was somehow changing him into someone he didn't recognize. The music video for No Rain, featuring the now iconic B-Girl character, would eventually turn Shannon and his bandmates into unlikely stars. But during the filming, Shannon was already showing signs of the struggles that would eventually consume him. He had begun using drugs not recreationally but medicinally as a way to quiet the voices in his head that told him he wasn't good enough, that his success was a fluke, that people would eventually figure out that he was just a scared kid from Indiana who had somehow fooled everyone into thinking he was a rock star. The irony was heartbreaking. Shannon had created music that made millions of people feel less alone, but he himself was becoming increasingly isolated, trapped inside a persona that felt both authentic and completely foreign to who he thought he really was. The rain that he had tried to sing away in his music was still falling inside his head, and no amount of external success seemed capable of making it stop. The summer of 1993 arrived like a dream that had somehow become reality, transforming Shannon Hoon from an unknown musician struggling to make rent into the unlikely voice of America's disaffected youth. No Rain was climbing the charts with a momentum that surprised everyone, including the band themselves, and suddenly Blind Melon found themselves thrust into the spotlight of MTV-era fame, with an intensity that none of them were prepared to handle. The success of the song and its accompanying video was meteoric and surreal. The bee-girl character, a young girl in a bee costume who felt like an outsider until she found her place with other dancing bees, became an instant cultural icon, representing everyone who had ever felt different or misunderstood. The music video played in heavy rotation on MTV, showing a joyful world of dancing bees and sunshine that seemed to promise escape from life's storms. But in the tour bus that same night, Shannon's video camera captured a different reality. While millions watched the bee girl find her happiness on television screens across America, Shannon sat alone in the narrow confines of his bunk, speaking directly to his lens. "Everyone thinks the video is about finding where you belong," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the bus engine's hum. "But what if you belong nowhere? What if the rain just follows you everywhere you go?" The contrast was devastating. MTV's bright, colorful celebration of belonging playing on television screens while its creator confessed his deepest fears to a camera that had become his only confidant. The voice that had sung sunshine to the world was drowning in its own private storm. But behind the scenes, Shannon was struggling with the strange disconnect between the joy his music brought to others and the increasing darkness he felt within himself. The touring schedule was relentless, the media attention was overwhelming, and the pressure to recreate the magic of No Rain was becoming crushing. More troubling still was the way that fame seemed to amplify all of his existing insecurities rather than resolving them. It was during this period that Shannon began his practice of documenting his life with a video camera. Initially as a way to capture the surreal experience of sudden stardom, but increasingly as a form of confession booth where he could speak honestly about his fears and struggles. The resulting footage, which would eventually total over 200 hours, provides an unprecedented glimpse into the mind of an artist grappling with success, addiction, and the weight of other people's expectations. "I'm not a rock star," Shannon confided to his camera during one late-night recording session. "I'm just a guy trying to make sense of the noise in my head." It was a statement that would prove prophetic, revealing the fundamental disconnect between Shannon's public image as the carefree voice of alternative rock and his private reality as someone who was struggling to stay afloat in waters that seemed to get deeper and more treacherous every day. The lifestyle that came with sudden fame was intoxicating and destructive in equal measure. Shannon found himself surrounded by people who wanted to be near his success, but he couldn't shake the feeling that most of them would disappear if the music stopped playing. The drugs that had initially been a way to cope with anxiety and stage fright were becoming a daily necessity, a way to quiet the voices that told him he was a fraud who would eventually be exposed. More troubling still was the way that success seemed to be changing his relationship with music itself. What had once been a private form of therapy was now a public performance, and Shannon began to feel like he was betraying something sacred by sharing his most intimate thoughts with arena crowds who screamed along to lyrics they didn't really understand. The rain that he had tried to sing away was still falling inside his head, but now he was expected to perform happiness for audiences who had bought tickets to see the man who had written the song about escaping sadness. The pressure to follow up No Rain with something equally successful was enormous, and it led to creative tensions within the band that had never existed before. Shannon's perfectionism, always present but previously manageable, became obsessive as he struggled to write songs that could match the impact of their breakout hit. He began second-guessing every lyric, every melody, every decision, afraid that anything less than perfection would prove that their success had been a fluke. Behind all that success, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? The question was becoming increasingly relevant as Shannon navigated the strange world of celebrity in the pre-internet age, when fame was more concentrated but also more isolating than it would later become. He was surrounded by people constantly but felt understood by almost no one, living in a fishbowl where every moment was scrutinized but where genuine human connection seemed increasingly impossible to find. The relationship with his bandmates, while still strong musically, was being strained by the pressures of success and Shannon's increasing dependence on substances. They could see that he was struggling, but the culture of rock and roll in the 1990s was one where such struggles were often seen as part of the artistic process, rather than warning signs of serious problems. The assumption was that Shannon's sensitivity and pain were what made his music so powerful, and there was a reluctance to interfere with what seemed to be a natural artistic process. Shannon's relationship with Lisa Krauss, which had begun before Blind Melon's success, was becoming one of the few stable elements in his increasingly chaotic life. Lisa understood Shannon in ways that most people couldn't, seeing past the public persona to the scared, sensitive person underneath. When she became pregnant with their daughter, Nico Blue, Shannon experienced a brief period of hope and clarity, believing that fatherhood might provide the anchor he needed to stay grounded in reality. But even the joy of becoming a father couldn't completely quiet the demons that were gaining strength in Shannon's mind. The touring schedule continued to be punishing, taking him away from Lisa and Nico just when they needed him most. And the guilt he felt about being an absent father only added to the depression and anxiety that were already threatening to overwhelm him. The question that haunted this period of Shannon's life was whether it was possible to be both a successful musician and a healthy human being, or whether the very qualities that made his music so powerful, his sensitivity, his openness to pain, his willingness to explore the darkest corners of human experience, also made him vulnerable to forms of suffering that success could never heal. The video camera that had become Shannon's constant companion captured it all. The moments of triumph and the hours of despair, the creative breakthroughs and the emotional breakdowns, the love for his daughter and the fear that he was destined to hurt everyone who got too close to him. What should have been a documentary of artistic achievement was becoming something much darker, a record of how talent and self-destruction could coexist in the same troubled soul. The year 1994 arrived with Blind Melon at the peak of their commercial success, but for Shannon Hoon, it marked the beginning of a descent that would prove impossible to reverse. The pressure to follow up their breakthrough debut album was enormous, and the band retreated to the studio to work on what would become Soup, a more experimental and introspective record that would showcase Shannon's evolving artistry, while also revealing the depth of his personal struggles. The recording process for Soup was unlike anything the band had experienced before. Where their first album had been created with the hungry energy of musicians who had nothing to lose, this second effort was weighed down by expectations and Shannon's increasing perfectionism. He would spend hours obsessing over single words in his lyrics, recording the same vocal parts dozens of times, never quite satisfied that he was capturing the emotions he was trying to convey. More troubling was the way Shannon's drug use was beginning to interfere with his ability to work effectively. He would arrive at the studio late, sometimes incoherent, often unable to deliver the performances that the songs required. The other band members watched helplessly as their friend and creative partner slowly destroyed himself, torn between their loyalty to Shannon and their frustration with his self-destructive behavior. The songs on Soup reflected Shannon's deteriorating mental state with devastating honesty. Tracks like Galaxy and Mouthful of Cavities dealt explicitly with themes of addiction, depression, and the feeling of being trapped in a life that looked successful from the outside but felt like a prison from within. In Change, Shannon wrote what would prove to be one of his most prophetic lyrics. "When life is hard, you have to change." It was advice he seemed unable to follow himself. The video camera that had become Shannon's constant companion captured the making of Soup in excruciating detail. Hours of footage show him struggling with lyrics, breaking down in tears during vocal sessions, and talking directly to the camera about his fears and frustrations. "I'm scared of being alone with myself," he confided during one particularly raw moment. "That's when the demons get loud." The album, when it was finally completed, was a masterpiece of alternative rock. More sophisticated and emotionally complex than anything Blind Melon had created before. But its commercial reception was disappointing compared to their debut, and Shannon took the relative failure personally, interpreting it as confirmation of his worst fears about his own worthiness as an artist. The touring cycle for Soup became a nightmare of missed shows, erratic performances, and increasingly desperate attempts by the band and their management to get Shannon the help he needed. He would disappear for days at a time, sometimes showing up for concerts in conditions that made it dangerous for him to perform. At a show in Chicago, he collapsed on stage and had to be carried off by paramedics, an incident that was captured by fans and bootlegged across the underground music scene. Did this tragic event mark their downfall, or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems? For Shannon, the Chicago incident represented the moment when his private struggles became public knowledge, when he could no longer maintain the fiction that everything was under control. The music press began writing about his problems with addiction, and suddenly Shannon found himself cast in the role of the self-destructive rock star, a character he had never wanted to play. The relationship with Lisa and Nico became increasingly strained as Shannon's behavior became more unpredictable. Lisa was trying to protect their daughter while also supporting the man she loved, but Shannon's addiction was making him someone she barely recognized. The home videos from this period show a man who was physically present but emotionally absent, going through the motions of family life while clearly fighting battles that no one else could see. The other members of Blind Melon were faced with an impossible choice. Continue enabling Shannon's self-destruction by allowing him to perform while intoxicated, or take a stand that might destroy the band but potentially save their friend's life. They chose intervention, organizing meetings with addiction specialists and threatening to break up the band if Shannon didn't get help. Shannon's response to these interventions was complex and contradictory. Part of him wanted to get clean, recognized that he was destroying everything he cared about, and made genuine attempts at sobriety. But another part of him had become so dependent on drugs, not just physically but emotionally, that the prospect of facing his demons without chemical assistance seemed impossible. The final tours of Shannon's life were characterized by a growing sense that he was running out of time. His performances became increasingly erratic, sometimes brilliant and sometimes barely coherent. The video footage from this period shows a man who was visibly deteriorating, gaunt, paranoid, and increasingly isolated even when surrounded by people. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? For Shannon, the question was becoming whether recovery was possible for someone whose art had been so intimately connected to his pain. He feared that getting sober might mean losing the sensitivity and emotional openness that made his music powerful, not understanding that his addiction was actually limiting his artistic abilities rather than enhancing them. The final entries in Shannon's video diary are almost unbearable to watch. He speaks directly to the camera with a lucidity that makes his inability to save himself even more tragic. "The rain never stops," he says in one of his final recordings, his voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't fall from the sky anymore. It only falls inside me, and I can't find an umbrella big enough to keep it out." It was the perfect encapsulation of his condition, the ability to articulate his pain with poetic precision, but the inability to translate that understanding into the healing he desperately needed. The man who had given millions of people hope through his music had become convinced that the storm inside him was permanent, that the very sensitivity that made his art so powerful also made his survival impossible. The autumn of 1995 found Shannon Hoon caught in a spiral that seemed to accelerate with each passing day, despite the desperate efforts of everyone who loved him to pull him back from the edge. The final months of his life were characterized by a growing sense of inevitability, as if he were documenting his own destruction with the same artistic integrity he had brought to his music. The video camera that had become his closest confidant captured it all. The moments of clarity when he recognized the need for change, and the longer periods of despair when change seemed impossible. The band's tour schedule continued relentlessly, driven by contractual obligations and the financial pressures that came with supporting a large organization of musicians, crew members, and industry professionals. Shannon was expected to perform night after night, city after city, channeling emotions he could barely control into songs that had been written during his most vulnerable moments. The irony was devastating. He was being asked to relive his trauma for the entertainment of audiences who had no idea they were watching someone slowly die on stage. Shannon's relationship with his daughter Nico Blue had become both his greatest source of joy and his deepest source of guilt. The home videos from this period show tender moments between father and daughter, Shannon singing lullabies, teaching her simple songs on guitar, marveling at her childhood innocence with the wonder of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be truly happy. But these moments were increasingly overshadowed by his awareness that his addiction was making him an unreliable and potentially dangerous presence in her life. "Music is the only way I know how to breathe," Shannon confided to his camera during one of his final recording sessions. But even music, which had once been his salvation, was becoming contaminated by the chaos of his personal life. He could no longer tell whether he was making art or simply documenting his own disintegration, whether his songs were healing others or just enabling his own self-destruction. The physical toll of years of substance abuse was becoming increasingly visible. Shannon, who had once possessed an otherworldly beauty that made him seem almost angelic on stage, was becoming gaunt and hollow-eyed. His voice, while still capable of moments of transcendent beauty, was showing signs of strain. The man who had once seemed to float through performances was now struggling to make it through entire sets without collapsing. The final weeks of Shannon's life were marked by a series of missed opportunities for intervention that would haunt everyone involved for years to come. There were moments when he seemed ready to accept help, when the fog of addiction would clear enough for him to see what he was doing to himself and the people who loved him. But the window for these moments of clarity was becoming shorter and shorter, and the undertow of his addiction was becoming too strong for anyone to fight. The last entries in Shannon's video diary are almost unbearable to watch. He speaks directly to the camera with a lucidity that makes his inability to save himself even more tragic. "The rain never stops," he says in one of his final recordings, It only falls inside me. It was a perfect encapsulation of his condition, the ability to articulate his pain with poetic precision, but the inability to translate that understanding into the action needed to heal. On October 21st, 1995, Shannon Hoon performed what would be his final show in Houston, Texas. The footage from that night shows flashes of the brilliance that had made him famous, moments when his voice soared above his physical and emotional limitations to touch something transcendent. But it also shows a man who was clearly at the end of his endurance, struggling to connect with an audience that loved him but couldn't save him. Were these final decisions acts of surrender, or courageous acts of self-preservation? In Shannon's case, the question becomes whether his death was a conscious choice, or the inevitable result of a disease that had progressed beyond his ability to control. The cocaine that killed him was not taken in a moment of celebration or recklessness, but as part of a daily ritual of self-medication that had become as necessary to his functioning as breathing. The tour bus where Shannon spent his final hours had become a kind of mobile prison, a metal capsule that carried him from city to city while isolating him from any possibility of genuine human connection. His bandmates were just a few feet away, but he might as well have been on another planet. The video camera sat silent on the table, finally unable to record the story it had been documenting for so long. The discovery of his body the next morning sent shockwaves through a music community that had been expecting this news while desperately hoping it would never come. Shannon Hoon had joined the tragic roster of gifted artists who had been unable to survive their own sensitivity, another casualty in the ongoing war between artistic genius and personal demons that has claimed so many lives throughout history. October 22nd, 1995. The call came just after dawn to radio stations across America, carrying news that would shatter the hearts of millions of fans who had found solace in Shannon Hoon's voice. The man who had sung about escaping the rain had been found dead on Blind Melon's tour bus, victim of an overdose that was both shocking and tragically predictable. At 28, Shannon had joined the ranks of artists whose deaths felt like a personal loss to everyone who had ever found comfort in their music. The scene on the tour bus was heartbreakingly simple. Shannon's body lay peaceful in his bunk, his video camera sitting silent on the nearby table like a faithful companion that had finally run out of stories to record. There were no signs of struggle, no dramatic final moments, just the quiet end of a voice that had meant everything to a generation of listeners who felt like outsiders in their own lives. Within hours of the news breaking, tributes began pouring in from across the music world and beyond. Radio stations played No Rain in heavy rotation, and MTV aired a hastily assembled memorial that tried to capture the impact Shannon had made in his brief time in the spotlight. But the most powerful tributes came from ordinary fans who called into radio shows and wrote letters to music magazines, sharing stories about how Shannon's music had helped them through their darkest moments. The irony was devastating and inescapable. Here was a man whose art had been about finding light in darkness, whose signature song had been an anthem of hope for people struggling with depression and alienation. Yet Shannon himself had been unable to find the very healing that his music had provided to others. The voice that had sung, "All I can say is that my life is pretty plain. I like watching the puddles gather rain," had been silenced by the very storms he had spent his career trying to weather. Axl Rose, Shannon's childhood friend who had provided him with his first taste of professional success, issued a statement that captured something essential about the loss. Shannon was one of the purest voices I ever knew. He sang like he was trying to heal the whole world, but nobody could figure out how to heal him. It was a sentiment that would be echoed by countless musicians who had known Shannon, all of them struggling to understand how someone so gifted at expressing emotion could have been so lost within his own feelings. The music industry's response to Shannon's death was complicated by guilt and soul-searching that went beyond the usual expressions of sympathy. Many began to question whether the culture of rock and roll had contributed to his destruction, whether the assumption that artistic sensitivity required suffering had prevented people from recognizing the severity of his condition. There was a growing awareness that treating addiction as a romantic aspect of the artistic lifestyle was not just naive, but potentially deadly. The most heartbreaking aspect of Shannon's death was the legacy he left behind for his daughter Nico Blue, who was just 18 months old when her father died. The hundreds of hours of video footage he had recorded would eventually become both a gift and a burden for her, a way to know the father she would never remember, but also a painful record of his struggles with demons that ultimately claimed his life. Lisa Krause's statement about Shannon's death was perhaps the most poignant tribute of all, coming from someone who had loved him not as a rock star, but as a man. Shannon was the gentlest soul I ever knew. He felt everything so deeply that the world became too much for him to bear. His music was his way of sharing that pain so others wouldn't have to carry it alone. I hope people remember him not for how he died, but for how beautifully he lived when the music was playing. The funeral was held in Shannon's hometown of Lafayette, Indiana, bringing his journey full circle from the small Midwestern town, where his dreams had been born, to the final resting place where they would be mourned. The service was attended by family, friends, and bandmates, but also by hundreds of fans who had traveled from across the country to say goodbye to someone whose voice had meant everything to them. As Shannon's casket was lowered into the ground beneath the gray Indiana sky, a light rain began to fall, the kind of gentle precipitation that had inspired some of his most beautiful lyrics. For those who had known him best, it felt like the completion of a circle that had begun with his first song about escaping the rain and ended with the rain finally setting him free. Someone in the crowd began humming "No Rain," and soon others joined in, their voices rising in a broken harmony. "And I start to complain that there's no rain." The irony was complete and devastating. Here were hundreds of people singing about the absence of rain while the sky wept for the man who had written those words. The voice that had promised sunshine but had been silenced by his own private storm. Shannon Hoon died as he had lived, trying to sing away the rain for everyone else while drowning in his own downpour. He gave the world sunshine through his music, but the storm inside him proved stronger than any song he could write. His 28 years burned bright as lightning across the musical landscape, beautiful, electric, and gone too soon. And perhaps that's the question we should all ask ourselves when we celebrate artists for their beautiful vulnerability. Are we also pushing them toward the very edge we claim to want to save them from? Shannon Hoon's voice brought light to millions, but in the end, no one could teach the rain inside him how to stop falling. The question is, will we learn to recognize the storms raging within before another irreplaceable voice is lost to the flood?